Welcome to Level Up Your Writing, presented by the Warminster Township Free Library. As I've mentioned in previous videos, a lot of how to write believable or interesting characters requires you to have an understanding of how people work. Oftentimes, this knowledge comes from experience and interacting with people in the real world. But sometimes even knowing some of the basics of psychology can help you create more complex and realistic characters. One example of a type of character where a little research can make a huge difference is with characters who are kids. Writing characters who are kids can be more complicated and difficult than many people might expect, and can trip up even experienced writers. There are many reasons why people struggle with writing kids, but a lot of it boils down to some combination of overestimating or underestimating the intelligence of kids, or not understanding how kids think and the reasons they act the way they do. When this is the case, the writer in question is going to have a hard time portraying characters believably to people who do understand kids. I talk a lot about not wanting to disrupt a reader's immersion in the story, and kids that don't act like kids is one way to ensure that happens, and can even ruin a reader's enjoyment of a character or story completely. I say this not to scare you, but so that I can hopefully give you some tips to avoid this outcome. Writing kids can be difficult in part because it takes a more conscious effort than it might take to write people your own age or to write adults, as you need to constantly question whether the thoughts or action the child character expresses are appropriate for their developmental stage. One example of how not understanding child development can ruin a reader's experience of a child character is with baby talk. People who don't spend a lot of time with very young kids may not realize that what many people call baby talk does not last as long into a young child's life as they might think. By baby talk, I mean a young child who is still learning grammar and pronunciation and will frequently mess it up. Even toddlers are able to form full sentences, though they are, of course, very simple and do contain some mistakes. However, even when a very young child makes a mistake in grammar, it tends to follow logical patterns and not the overly exaggerated baby talk that is sometimes found in writing. An example of what I mean by following logical patterns is kids not knowing the exceptions to English's complex grammar rules. As people grow older, they learn the confusing and tricky exceptions, but a kid isn't going to inherently know or understand, for example, that the past tense of jump is jumped, but the past tense of run isn't runned. If they think that making something happen in the past just takes adding ed to the end of the word, they're going to make mistakes until they learn which words are exceptions and which aren't. And that is something that is really only learned through experience and exposure. Figuring out what age kids will grow into proper grammar can be tricky, but it is essential to selling your child characters as accurate representations of children. Similar to grammar, vocabulary is one thing you can help your readers see the characters as kids. You'll want to make sure you use shorter and less complex sentences and simpler vocabulary. Think not just about a kid's age when you do this, but also their education and their upbringing. There are a lot of other aspects to writing good child characters besides grammar and vocabulary. One of these, in which vocabulary is often a facet, is not under or overestimating the intelligence of kids. Kids are not stupid. They are observant and clever. They just don't always have the ability to express themselves the same way that adults can. On the other hand, try not to make your kids all child geniuses either. There's a balance you'll have to strike. You'll want to remember that their upbringing will affect what they know and believe. If you're having trouble figuring out a child character's dialogue and writing it in a child's voice instead of the voice of someone with more life experience, one thing you may find useful is to write the dialogue as you normally would, and then go back in and simplify and adjust it once you determine what you want the kid to express. Another thing to keep in mind when writing children's dialogue is that kids are often fairly blunt. Young kids rarely purposefully say things with layered or double meanings. On the other hand, kids are likely to exaggerate. And not just in what they say either. A kid's emotions are also more likely to be exaggerated as well. For example, a kid might seemingly overreact to an unfortunate incident, but in reality they just have less experience to compare that incident against other things. Their extreme emotions have reasons, even if adults may have a hard time understanding them. So you'll want to make sure that when you write your kids' emotions that you understand the reasons behind them. Another aspect of writing interesting child characters is developing their personalities. Kids are individuals with their own unique personalities and wills of their own. They are not typically passive. Even shy kids will have a presence that other characters will notice. In addition, try to avoid stereotypes like overly cutesy kids or other caricatures that exaggerate and simplify your child characters, especially when other characters in your story are complex and fully fleshed out. When creating child characters, the same guidelines and rules that apply to adult characters will apply to kids as well. Your child characters should be every bit as detailed as any other character in terms of backstories, motivation, goals, priorities, conflicts, etc. Don't cut corners just because they're a kid. You can think about how their parents and their upbringing will affect all of these aspects of their characterization. To close out this video, I'm going to reiterate something I said at the start, and that's to do research if you're not sure what to do. You don't have to spend hours and hours poring over information, but it may be especially helpful for you to look up what milestones and developmental stages an average kid will have at the age your character is, even if all you get is just a general idea. For today's writing exercise, take a character of yours or a character from a story you love and figure out what that character's backstory, motivation, goals, priorities, conflicts, etc. are at various stages of their life. How do these things change as they get older? What stays the same? For example, what are the similarities and differences in them from ages 3 to 6 to 9 to 12 to 15? And that is the end of this video, and next week I'm going to talk a little bit more about researching and how you can add research to your story and different ways you can go about researching for your story.